At the time, of course, knowing what I do as a writer, looking back, I can't imagine a life that would give me more odd and wonderfully amusing material to draw on in my novels and my nonfiction work as well. I was born in Switzerland in 1952 to a mother and father who had come over in 1947 to help children in bombed-out cities as evangelical, fundamentalist, Presbyterian, Reformed, ultra-Calvinist missionaries who arrived in Europe and then promptly broke with their mission board. One thing you have to understand about good old-time religion is that they all hate each other. And eventually, had you been at my mother's funeral in March, for instance, of this year, she died at 98, and the work had been inherited by various brothers-in-law, because the other thing that we were very good at was a kind of nepotistic structure in all our organizations. But I was very worried going to the funeral because none of these folks had spoken to each other for 20 years. The only one they would talk to is me because I had left, so I don't count. Kind of like Michael Corleone in The Godfather. I wasn't going to take over the mob, so I didn't matter anymore. Sort of like the Arab boys that the Orthodox Jews in Israel have run the elevator on Sunday because they can make fire on the Sabbath, it doesn't matter. So I come from a background that is fraught, to put it mildly. My earliest childhood memory that kind of sticks in terms of knowing that I belonged to a religion that was going to be lots of trouble was when we would go to Italy, which in the early 1960s of Fellini's La Dolce Vita was a cheap vacation from Switzerland where my parents had their little mission. And they had no money back in those days. This was before my mother and dad became celebrities in the evangelical subculture. So we would take the train down to Portofino on vacation, and from about age 8 on, I started noticing that while everybody dug into their antipasti or pastini and brodo, whatever it was they were having in the pensione, my mother was launching into long graces that were designed not to thank God for the food, but to evangelize the other vacation goers who were sort of Brits who had come down to the Riviera, and we always knew them. In those days, we always went to the same place. Or Italians, and of course the Italians, were all either in the Communist Party, so they didn't do much religion, or if they were Roman Catholic, they should have did something like that before they ate. If they were Anglicans, as my father always called them, C of E, he said, represented Christmas and Easter, which was the only time those people go to church.
Well, there's not an ounce of truth.
Right, not an ounce of truth. So anyway, Mom would be praying these long graces, and I guess my first inkling of just how I was being raised, as if I was a third party observing myself, was looking across at a little girl called Jennifer, who came every summer, and who I, by 8, was interested in. I knew this was a friend of mine, but she would be sitting there looking at us with all our heads bowed, while everyone else is almost ready for their second course. And she would catch my eye as I would glance up, and she'd go, and from that moment on, I knew that God might or might not have called us to be saved, but he had certainly called us to be weird. And one thing a kid doesn't want to be is weird. And out of that came this series of the Calvin Becker trilogies, Portofino, Zermatt, Saving Grandma. And then to fast forward to And God Said Billy, as a kind of a bookend to this process, after having come out of the evangelical background I was raised in, it's taken years to really acknowledge the fact that I lived in a state of religious delusion, almost mental illness, for the first third of my life so far. And so And God Said Billy really is my attempt to unpack that from the inside and track what it is like to really think that in the case of my character Billy, God has called you to Hollywood to save what he thinks of as all the bad Jews. In other words, all those who have not either joined Jews for Jesus and or returned to Israel to fulfill prophecy. And so Billy's out there doing the work of God that isn't working out quite as he had planned because he has to be shoplifting to support his habit of reaching people for Jesus because no one else will support him. But he's okay with that because God, after all, called David to maraud all through the Middle East and conquer peoples and slaughter the Midianites and whoever else they were at war with. So a little shoplifting with a pork chop now and then might be okay. And these books kind of chart that passage out of my evangelical background. And if you're more interested in the specifics, you can read some of my memoirs like Crazy for God and other books, which I kind of actually detail our life in the religious right after my dad became the founder of the religious right, and I, in an nepotistic tradition, became his sidekick. And I was flying around this country at age 20, in Jerry Falwell's borrowed jet and going to visit whoever happened to be in the White House to discuss policy issues, literally as a 20-year-old, of how to bring pro-life Roman Catholics and evangelicals into the Republican Party. And so was in at the start of the religious right. Knew everyone, literally knew all the people who were involved at that point. I was on the 700 Club maybe 7 or 8 times. Dr. Dobson on Focus on the Family gave away 250,000 copies of a right-wing evangelical screed I wrote called A Time for Anger. And so I was a player, walked away from that. By 1990 I was out, started a process of withdrawal in 1985. Got out, have written some about that. And again, And God Said Billy really charts that journey in a fiction sense that strangely wound up with me as Chris Hitchens once asked me why I'm not an atheist. And he said, you know, I read your books. He loved Crazy for God. And he started emailing me about it and wondered why I wasn't going to do what he does. And so I had to explain to him that, first of all, psychologically, I could not make that break. And I admit that, you can only recover to a certain degree. But secondly, my life has been impacted by unlooked for grace. And I guess the definition of grace is that it's always unlooked for. And so you cannot walk away from, I know this will sound odd, having been saved from Christianity without thanking God for the process. And far from making me an atheist, it's just simply made me a very bad Christian. One who sees that necessarily communion with those things that are unknown to us, the paradox of life, the mystery that sort of it is that line between our brains and our minds. And for me, that last step is just simply not possible. So And God Said Billy winds up with a character who is assaulted and mugged by grace before it's all over, but certainly unlooked for. So that's a long, rambling, crazy answer, but there you are. I told you I was delusional. There we go.
I'll follow up to that. In the years that you were palling around with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson et al.,
right?
Did you think about the child who did this to you during the prayer? And did you, I want to stop short of saying that I think there are nuts. Did you think you were
nuts? Well, you put this in the past tense, so that's all.
Well, I was being generous.
Yeah, that's true.
Did you think it was crazy?
Yeah, I mean, and fortunately we're in a church that has a bar, so you're not going to mind the language. If you do, get a drink, calm yourselves.
Yeah, we're real proud of that. We try never to serve before 11 o'clock.
But honestly, and I'm not. This is not facetious, and I'm not making this up. I can remember a moment when I was the keynote speaker at the Southern Baptist Convention when my dad was dying of cancer in the early '80s, and they sent me as his replacement. And by then I was already very much aware, having been raised as this missionary kid in Switzerland with a stint in some British private schools, but not really knowing much about America at all, except the times I traveled with Dad, and it's, hotel to venue, back again to airplanes, and that's it. Never really having been here. Jean and I moved here in 1980 with 2 little children and pregnant with a third. And I was discovering the real America, not the one the religious right, sort of the precursor to Fox News' version of America, but the one I was living in, next to gay neighbors and in the Northeast, and with Boston as our big city and so forth. And I was having grave doubts, but also was making a lot of money as an evangelical. Literally, I made 10 times more as an evangelical personage than I've ever made since as a writer or even a Hollywood movie director of small B movies. I mean, the big money for me was then, and I mean lots. So I was having doubts, but I also knew that I hadn't been raised to do anything but this. This is the family business, the God business. So I can remember standing backstage in an enormous venue behind some curtains, and there were 24,000 Southern Baptist preachers out there. It's kind of a sea of pale blue polyester with stitching. And I literally walked up to the podium and I gave a great speech, got a thunderous, long standing ovation. I was good at this. But all the way up to the podium under my breath, and I'm not kidding you, I just walked up with my head down, repeating again and again in a whisper to myself, I'm fucked. I'm fucked. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having me. And I knew that this was not going to work. It was kind of, I sympathize with Prince Charles. I mean, you want to be an architect or something, and then somebody tells you, I'm very sorry, you're the next king of England. Not that you'll ever be crowned, because your mother's going to live forever. And one day he wakes up and says, Balmoral Castle's very nice, but I had my destiny chosen for me. So I got out, I just squeaked out in the last 10 seconds, and just thank God for my wife Jeannie, who said, instead of making those shitty movies in Hollywood that you would never pay to go see, because those are the kind of scripts I got. After I left the evangelical world, write some of those stories you told our children about growing up in Switzerland. So I wrote Portofino, and it became quite a successful book and gave me permission to keep writing. And that's how I kind of got out. But in terms of my departure, I would just say two things about it. Part of it was aesthetic. This is a very ugly world, and I have certain artistic instincts. And part of it was theological. It's just nonsense to believe what you're supposed to believe as a fundamentalist Christian. If you haven't completely snapped and you look at it all objectively. And the third thing was the religious right was forming. And I was in the Groucho Marx position of saying, I would never belong to a club that would have someone like me for a member. I knew these guys from the inside. And I'm telling you, the layers of hypocrisy and the layers of greed and the layers of power trips and sheer insanity, the depth of people who literally you could not picture being successful in any other profession because being con men for Jesus is literally all they could do. These things began to weigh upon me, and so part of it was just ego. Of saying, hey, I'm better than this. I may have inherited this mantle, but I can't do this. And my marriage would have broken up. I was treating my wife horribly. I was away 6 months of the year on the road doing all this crazy stuff. And the choice was, multiple factors came together, and it was just like, you got to get out of here. So I did. I ran away, and it was a tough transition. And again, the toughness of that transition is what And God Said really is about. And also, I wrote a couple of, memoirs I've written, especially Crazy for God, really tracks the journey out of the religious right and the formation of it.
The subtitle for Crazy for God is How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, Helped Found the Religious Right, and Lived to Take All or Almost All of it back. It's an interesting book. In a comment a few minutes back, you said something maybe a throwaway comment, but maybe you really meant it. You said in talking about recovering from fundamentalism that nobody can recover the whole way.
Right.
Do you really mean that?
Yeah, I do.
But this is my real question.
Yeah.
I believe you mean it too. But my question is, what would recovering the whole way look like to you? Is that what you really want?
Well, I'll give you an analogy. I had polio when I was 2. My parents sort of forgot to get me vaccinated when they were in the Ile de France going back to Europe, just as the transition between everybody getting vaccinated and not. And I survived fine. I'm sitting here. I have an atrophied left leg and so on. But it happened so early in my childhood that I don't remember what it's like not to have an atrophied left leg. I don't know what it would be like to be able to put on a pair of shoes that really fit on both feet. It's not a big deal. It's just that's one of the things that is who you are. Fast forward, I was one of Arianna Huffington's first bloggers, and she got in touch with me when she started the HuffPost, and I've been blogging for her ever since. I had one up this morning, by the way, called America Does Not Have a Political Problem, America Has a Dumb Religion Problem. But
How subtle.
Yeah, very subtle. Very subtle. Which actually gets to this point, and that is, I found that my writing in my books, I like to think is good writing. I also like to think when I write my memoirs and so forth, my editor told me that he had not read a more compassionate portrait of my parents, that someone would have left and so on. But I'm well suited to the full contact blood sport of kickboxing and cage fighting that blogging has become. And I find that my fundamentalist chops are perfect when put to the service of Barack Obama during his election and so forth. And I get some nasty responses back, and often they're fully deserved. because I will go for the throat by instinct. I'm like one of these people like the Bourne conspiracy movies that doesn't know why he's a killer, but eventually figures out I was bred to do this. So yeah, you just change the words from theology to politics, and my blogging writing and my writing, if I can put it that way, are two totally different things. So I'm like a boxer that goes into the ring, comes out, and is a very good grandfather in another role in life. It's not personal, it's just business. But my formation in the evangelical community made me a really good hitman for the left. And it's not something I'm necessarily proud or ashamed of, it's just the way it is. But I find myself sometimes having to say to myself, this is too far. This is the old you boiling through to the surface. You're supposed to be a moderate progressive now. This doesn't sound moderate or progressive, back off. And gradually I've had to learn that. So the blogs are tough, but I reserve the harsher comments for people who I think are doing such great damage that you're almost sounding at a fire alarm, and that's a different kind of thing. But that's where I see the old knee-jerk habit boil through, and I'm not necessarily happy about that.
When you write compassionately about your parents, is it